think our relationship was, if I want to analyse it, I think we really both loved and wanted to do what was best for Man United, and there was huge respect between us. Unfortunately, that was probably lost.
For one reason or another, he decided to go and criticise his teammates, and so most of you have not seen that video, but you couldn't release it. They couldn't release it.
Roy Keane looked his own teammates in the eye and told them they weren't good enough. Not in private, not in a quiet word after training, on camera, in front of the world, with a calm that somehow made it worse than if he'd been screaming. He didn't need to raise his voice to destroy someone's reputation. He just needed to be honest. I am Oliver, and this is Sport Icons. And the longer his career went on, the more isolated that honesty made him. In dressing rooms, in dugouts, behind studio desks, he watched the game fill up with players who were celebrated before they'd earned it, paid before they'd proved it, and protected by a media culture that mistook potential for achievement. Keane had no interest in that arrangement. He never had. This is the story of 8 players Roy Keane publicly called out, questioned, or outright dismissed. Some were his own teammates, some were players he watched from the punditry desk. All of them felt the full weight of his standards, and those standards were not negotiable. By 2005, Manchester United were in a rough patch that felt impossible to imagine, given what the club had been just a few years earlier. The treble winners of 1999 felt like a distant memory, and a 4-1 defeat to Middlesbrough tore through any remaining pretense that things were fine. What followed became one of the most talked about moments in Premier League history. Keane sat down in front of an MUTV camera and said what he thought, directly, without the diplomatic softening footballers usually use to protect each other in public. He named names, and one of those names was Kieran Richardson. Richardson was 20 years old at the time, a left-sided midfielder with real ability and a future that looked bright on paper. But Keane wasn't interested in potential. He questioned publicly whether Richardson was at the level required to play for Manchester United. And for a young player hearing that from the captain, it wasn't the kind of feedback you forget. The MUTV rant never aired in full. United pulled the tape before it could be broadcast, which only made it more famous once it leaked. Keane wasn't singling Richardson out as the only problem. He was using him as an example of a wider cultural failure, which in some ways was even harder to absorb. You weren't just being told you'd had a bad game, you were being told you represented everything that had gone wrong. Keane never walked it back. That tells you everything about how seriously he meant it. Darren Fletcher ended up being a genuinely respected player at Manchester United, someone who battled through serious illness and came out the other side still competing. By the end of his time at Old Trafford, a lot of people had real warmth for him, but that ending doesn't erase what came before it, and what came before it included Roy Keane having serious doubts about whether Fletcher belonged at that level at all. Keane's criticism wasn't a single headline moment like the Richardson comments. It was a sustained skepticism, a running assessment that Fletcher wasn't imposing himself on games the way a central midfielder at United needed to. Keane's opinion carried enormous weight in that dressing room. If he thought you were good enough, that meant something. If he didn't, you felt it every day. Fletcher pushed through the doubt, through the illness that nearly ended his career entirely, and kept coming back. Whether Keane's early criticism hardened him or simply reflected where he was at that point is hard to say. But Fletcher didn't let it end his story, and Keane never offered a public reassessment. That's not really his way. John O'Shea was the versatile one, the man who could play anywhere across the back line, fill in at midfield if needed, and do what was asked without making a fuss. Ferguson trusted it. Supporters appreciated it. But dependable wasn't a word that carried much weight with Keane when the performances weren't there. After that Middlesbrough defeat, the same one that had already put Richardson in the crosshairs, O'Shea found himself on the wrong end of Keane's judgment too. The accusation wasn't about a single mistake. Keane looked at the collective display and concluded that several players, O'Shea among them, weren't performing at the standard United demanded. Not occasionally, not because of a hard run of fixtures, but as a pattern. Players who had enough ability to stay in the squad, but weren't pushing hard enough. What made Keane's frustration particularly pointed was that it wasn't personal animosity, it was expectation. O'Shea was good enough to be there, and that's exactly why Keane felt entitled to demand more from him. O'Shea went on to earn well over 100 caps for the Republic of Ireland, and captained his country through a rebuild. He handled Keane's comments without public grievance, quietly, professionally, getting on with it. That measured response probably irritated Keane less than most. Alan Smith arrived at Manchester United from Leeds in the summer of 2004. He had an unquestioned work ethic and a combative energy that filled a certain role. He was never going to be the most technically gifted man in that dressing room, and he knew it. He made up for it in effort. The problem was that effort alone wasn't satisfying Keane's requirements when the results weren't coming. When Keane sat in front of that MUTV camera after Middlesbrough, Smith was part of the dissection. Keane's view was that too many players were coasting, leaning on the club's reputation rather than earning the right to wear the shirt. Smith fell into that assessment. You couldn't accuse Smith of not caring. That was never his problem. His problem, in Keane's eyes, was that caring wasn't translating into the kind of decisive contribution United's biggest matches required. Passion without precision was only worth so much. Smith eventually suffered a serious leg break in an FA Cup tie against Liverpool in 2006, came back and kept playing. What's certain is that Keane believed what he said, and Smith, like the others, had to live with having it said. Most of the players Keane went after were younger, still finding their feet, still building the kind of reputation that could absorb a public hit and recover from it. Rio Ferdinand was different. By the mid-2000s, Ferdinand was already one of the most expensive defenders in football history, a genuine cornerstone of both the Manchester United backline and the England squad, a player who had earned his status through performances that were, at their best, genuinely exceptional. None of that protected him from Keane. The criticism Keane aimed at Ferdinand cut through the usual logic of dressing room hierarchy. You might expect a captain to protect his biggest names, to save the harshest words for the peripheral players, and let the stars operate with some breathing room. Keane didn't work that way. His argument was almost the opposite. The more you were earning, the more you were celebrated, the less excuse you had for not performing at the absolute top of your ability every single time you stepped onto the pitch. What he said about Ferdinand was specific, in a way that made it sting more than a general dig would have. Keane mocked the idea that a decent 20-minute stretch in a game made someone a superstar. He connected it directly to Ferdinand's wages, which at the time were among the highest at the club, and used that connection to make a point about accountability. Big contract, big platform, big reputation. None of it counted unless the performance matched the billing, week in and week out, not just in patches. Ferdinand has spoken about the Keane era in the United dressing room since, and the picture he paints is of an environment where that kind of pressure was constant. It wasn't always comfortable, and it wasn't always fair in the way that purely transactional feedback might be. But it was honest, and it came from a man whose own standards never dipped, regardless of what was happening around him. What makes the Ferdinand dynamic interesting when you set it next to the Richardson or O'Shea criticism is the difference in stakes. Richardson was a young player whose place at the club was genuinely uncertain. Ferdinand was a senior figure who was going nowhere. Keane wasn't trying to move him on. He was demanding that a player with every reason to be satisfied with himself find a reason to want more. When Keane moved from the dressing room to the punditry desk, his standards didn't soften. If anything, the removal of any personal relationship with the players he was watching sharpened his willingness to say exactly what he thought. Nobody attracted his attention quite like Paul Pogba. Pogba returned to Manchester United from Juventus in 2016 for a world record fee, which immediately set the terms for how every performance would be measured. Keane watched from the studio and reached his verdict quickly. The word he kept coming back to was problem. Not a player with problems, a problem, as in something the club needed to manage rather than build around. He went after Pogba's awareness, his defensive contribution, his leadership, or the absence of it. A player of Pogba's profile had a responsibility to dictate games the way genuine midfield leaders do, and Keane kept finding evidence he wasn't meeting it. He said so repeatedly, across different seasons, different managers, different versions of Pogba's time at the club. Pogba's defenders would point to the range of passing, the physicality when he chose to use it, the goals that changed games. Keane wasn't interested. The question, as always, was who you are across 90 minutes, across a full season. What made Keane's criticism of Pogba feel different from his United-era comments was the accumulation of it. This wasn't one bad game, or one poor run of form. Season after season, Keane sat in studios and watched Pogba drift in and out of matches, produce something brilliant, then disappear for 40 minutes. And he kept asking the same question. Where is he when the team is suffering? When United were losing, when the midfield needed someone to take the game by the throat, Pogba's presence was intermittent at best. For Keane, that That inconsistency wasn't a quirk of style, it was a character failure dressed up as flair. He also went after the circus around Pogba, the social media, the sponsors, the constant noise about potential departures, the agent drama. Keane's feeling was that all of it was evidence of a player more interested in his own brand than in the shirt he was wearing. That wasn't just a football problem, it was a leadership vacuum right in the middle of the pitch where United needed it most. Pogba left United without a fee in 2022. Keane had made his assessment long before the ending confirmed it. By the time Declan Rice established himself as one of England's most important midfielders, Keane had already been through Pogba, Ferdinand, and the United generation that had disappointed him. Rice was a different kind of target. Keane didn't dismiss him entirely. Instead, he took the position that Rice was being talked about as though he'd already arrived at the top of the game, and the evidence during England matches didn't support that yet. The concerns Keane kept circling back to were positioning, defensive awareness, and consistency. His problem was with the gap between how Rice was being described and what he was actually producing when England needed him to control midfield under genuine pressure in a major tournament. He felt that gap was being glossed over because Rice had the profile and the price tag, having moved to Arsenal for over £100 million, that made people reluctant to hold him to account. Keane had no patience for the idea that promise could substitute for consistent performance at the highest level. The shirt said England. The number said you were the midfield anchor. The standard was fixed, not adjustable based on age or market value. There was a broader point running underneath the Rice criticism that Keane kept returning to. English football had developed a habit of deciding its young midfielders had arrived before they'd actually been tested at the sharp end of a tournament. Players got the transfer fee, got the captain's armband at club level, got the profile, and suddenly they were being talked about as world class. Keane had watched that pattern enough times to know what it usually meant. It meant the media had made a decision that the performances hadn't yet backed up. He didn't think Rice was a bad player. He thought the gap between the praise and the proof was being politely ignored, and he wasn't willing to ignore it. Rice has the years ahead of him to either confirm or complicate that verdict, but Keane put his flag in the ground early, and he's never been the type to quietly move it when the wind shifts. The Aston Villa chapter of Keane's management career was brief and painful, and it ended in a way that told you something about how wide the gap was between what he expected and what he found when he walked through the door. He took the job in 2014, with Villa sliding toward relegation trouble, inherited a dressing room that he quickly concluded was nowhere near the standard required, and within a matter of months was gone, with the club still in difficulty and a series of comments about the squad burning behind him on the way out. The atmosphere inside the club, by the accounts that came out during and after his time there, was one of entrenched habits and low expectations. Players who had been comfortable too long, a culture that had accepted mid-table survival as its ceiling. Keane walked in expecting professional footballers to respond to a crisis the way professional footballers should, with effort, urgency, and embarrassment at their own performances. What he found, in his telling, was something closer to indifference. Keane didn't always name individuals directly when he talked about what he'd encountered at Villa, but his language wasn't subtle enough to leave much doubt about who he meant. He used words like imposters and scumbags to describe the attitude he found from senior players who, in his view, were collecting wages while the club dropped toward the championship without anything resembling the fight he demanded from anyone he managed. Those words landed publicly, and the player they were most widely connected to was Gabriel Agbonlahor. Agbonlahor had been at Villa his entire career. He was the local boy, the academy product who'd made it, the one supporters' favourite who represented what the club wanted to believe about itself. He had genuine pace and had been a real threat in his younger years, the kind of striker who could turn a game with a single run in behind. But by the time Keane arrived, Agbonlahor's best seasons were behind him, and the effort levels Keane was witnessing in training and in matches didn't match what the moment required. The imposters comment was particularly savage because of what it implied. It wasn't just that these players were having a bad run of form. Keane was saying they didn't belong at a professional level in the first place, that they were occupying space at a club in crisis without the character or the work rate to justify it. For Agbonlahor, carrying the weight of being the homegrown senior player in that environment, the association with those words had a lasting effect on how his career at Villa was remembered once it eventually wound down. Keane's time at the club didn't fix anything, but he made absolutely sure everyone knew exactly what he thought he'd walked into. 8 players. 8 different moments where Keane looked at someone and decided the gap between what they were giving and what the shirt demanded was too wide to stay quiet about. Some proved him wrong over time, some didn't. A few never really got the chance to answer back on the pitch. The thing that runs through every one of these stories isn't cruelty. It's a standard Keane applied to himself first. Every game, every training session, through injuries and pressure and a dressing room that didn't always want to hear what he had to say. He just refused to lower it for anyone else. That made him a captain other players feared and respected in equal measure, and it made him a pundit other players dreaded seeing on their television screens. The game moved on around him. Wages went up, profiles got bigger, tolerance for difficult truths got smaller. Keane didn't move with it. Whether that made him a great leader or an impossible one probably depends on which side of his judgment you ended up on. But none of the 8 players on this list would tell you he didn't mean every word. If you want more stories like this, subscribe and drop your take in the comments below.